Welcome to The Right Stuff, your home for all things on the writing craft. I'm your host, James Mansfield, and today we're going to be talking about POV. This can be a tricky subject because there are some opinions on it that not everyone agrees with, same as nearly every other topic on writing, but it's important to talk about regardless so that you can understand it and be aware of how POV works. Keep in mind, if you find this content helpful, please like and subscribe and join in on the conversation. So POV, first of all, I think especially if you're a new writer, it's important to talk about what POV is. What does it mean? Again, I'm going over this part for anyone who may not have heard this term before or maybe doesn't even know what POV stands for. So POV stands for point of view. It's the method by which you're telling your story. It's the who you're telling the story through. It's, are you telling your story via an all-knowing narrator? Are you telling the story through your main character but from afar? Are you telling the story as the main character? So let's kind of start in with the different types of POV, and then we'll get into sort of the rules and expectations of POV. The first kind is first person. This is when you're telling the story as the main character. It's most evidenced by the use of the pronoun I. Your main character can still be anything or anyone, but whenever you're telling the story, your prose will use I or me or mine rather than say he or she, or even using the character's name. Because if your main character's name is, say, Jill, you wouldn't have your character say something and then say Jill said. You would say I said, because the main character is Jill. So an example of this, the table jerked toward the stove. I stopped with my hands on my hips. If this ghost was going to try and frighten me out of my own home, it had another thing coming. So in this example, if you can tell that the story is being told through the main character experiencing this paranormal event by the use of I and my, and by the use of the character's voice. And when I say voice, I mean that we're given specific insight to the character's reaction to the ghost without dialogue. So using first person can be a little tricky when it comes to introducing your readers to your main character's name or even description. In this case, it has to be done either through narration that references those things, or it'll have to be done by another character. And obviously your readers can't go for nearly a chapter before being introduced to your character, which means you've got to work it in pretty quickly. You kind of have to work it in quickly no matter which POV you use, but you can kind of rely on other characters to speak your main character's name in those instances. When you're writing in first person, you have to kind of declare your main character's name without sounding forced, and if you wait too long, like, it's going to distance your readers from your main character. On another note, just something to keep in mind as you're writing or maybe starting to write your first novel, first person first person has kind of been on the rise lately, and it's becoming pretty popular. So that's, just keep that in mind, and maybe you feel more comfortable writing in first person rather than third person, which we'll get to in a minute. But next is second person, and I mentioned this in another video, but I have very limited experience even reading in second person, and absolutely no experience writing in second person. This is basically when the author is telling the reader the story by talking directly to them. It's identified by the use of the pronoun you. In essence, you as the reader are the main protagonist. It's very strange and a very unique way of telling a story. There's a few other tools and implications you can utilize to tell the story through a second person narrative, but overall this type is really difficult to do and typically isn't even well received by industry professionals. So if you want to chance it, if you want to try it, go for it, but just keep in mind it could be difficult. So then we come to third person. This is probably the most common type of POV used. When using third person POV, the story is told from this like pulled out view. It's like you're kind of taking a step back. It's a narrator telling the reader what's happening to the character and describing the setting. And this is typically identified through he, she, it, they, them, and so on. And you can kind of think of third person simply as the author telling you the story of what happened, almost like a buddy telling you the story about themselves in college, or an anecdote, if I can say that right. Again, this can be done a few different ways, and a particular way might serve your story better than another. However, two of the main methods for using third person are third limited, or sometimes called third close, and third omniscient. Third limited is a little more like storytelling. Sorry, third limited is a little more like telling the story in first person. As you're telling the story, the narrator is giving you the information from the perspective of one character at any given time. This means that you can only describe what this character is thinking, feeling, seeing, etc. at that moment. Of course, sorry about that. Of course, other characters can still speak, and the main POV character can still notice what others are doing, but you can't really go inside their heads. So if the story is being told through Ginny, you can't suddenly say what Greg is thinking, because at that time the POV is through Ginny. If you were to change perspective to Greg in the next scene or chapter, then you could say what he's thinking. In the same way, you can't describe the current setting on a different continent, city, region, area, etc., unless of course your character has been there before and is recalling the description of that setting. With this method, you're getting into a character's head, and as such, it follows this kind of path of logic that you have to pay attention to as you're writing. Otherwise, it's real easy to kind of get confused or switch without even quite recognizing it. Third, omniscient, and omniscient means all-knowing, is when you have a narrator who can tell you like all the aspects of a story at any given time. And when you do this, you can tell the reader what Greg and Ginny from our previous example are thinking at the same time, or even in the same sentence. I like to think of third omniscient as sort of this puppet master way of storytelling. Tell your readers everything they need to know and wait to reveal information until the perfect time. But at the same time, this aspect can make it difficult to pull off well. As an omniscient narrator, you as the writer, your balance of information has to be given out in such a way that it tells the story and doesn't just like spill out as these huge info dumps to your readers. Unlike third limited here, the narrator isn't really in a particular character's head. The narrator describes things and people as they are and as they're perceived by any one party. So for instance, in third omniscient, you might describe your main character's like crime or maybe like a mistake within like a small village, just as an example. In the very same paragraph, you might describe the village's reaction to that mistake and how the village now perceives your main character. Whereas in third limited, your main character might have fled the scene after his crime and might never have faced anyone at all in the village, meaning they would have no insight at all as to how he's viewed as a consequence of that crime. Now, I certainly found these concepts to be pretty dizzying when I first started writing. It took me a while to get a real good grasp on it. So just let me encourage you to sweep the web for examples of each kind and just look further into different ways you can use the varying types of POV and different examples that kind of showcase how it's used. Also, practice is going to help you a lot. Just try to get a feel for them. Write some things, write some practice paragraphs down, write some practice short stories down. The more you sort of play with them, the more concrete your grasp on POV is going to become. So with POV comes some rules that While you can break, and published authors have certainly broken them successfully, you still kind of need to be aware of them. So the first is changing POV within a work. Some might say you shouldn't do this, and maybe this is good for a rule of thumb, but it doesn't mean that it can't be successfully done. For instance, if you go to first person to third person, and if done incorrectly or in a particular way, it could really disorient the reader or even frustrate the reader. On the other hand, doing something like this can really give the reader a deep insight and understanding to a character's goals and motivations. So if you're telling the story from a third person, almost like limited, where you're still inside a character's head for most of it, and then you switch to first person for a particular scene for a particular reason, it can really help the reader feel more connected because you're suddenly using I for the main character, and you can really get kind of this feeling like you really understand and know what this character is going through by being like right there within their eyes, within their head. One example of an author who does this right, or at least well, is Diana Gabaldon. So I mean, I don't remember which book in particular she does this, but at least one of them I know she does it, and she does it well. Another pitfall that you want to watch out for with POV is head hopping. And this is where you switch from one character's POV to another's, all within the same scene, especially if you do it multiple times. You're going to confuse the dickens out of your readers. The typical rule of thumb on this is one POV to a scene. I've even heard the advice that you should only do one POV per chapter. I've kind of played around with both sides of this, but so like if you're going on a POV from one character and you want to switch, it's best to change the scene or change the chapter when you go to another POV. So if you're head hopping, what you're doing is you're taking one scene and you're telling what this person's thoughts are, then you're telling what this person's thoughts are, then you're telling what this person's thoughts are, and you can't do that without kind of just confusing the crap out of people. So has head hopping been done successfully? Not to my knowledge. Could it be? Maybe. It really depends on your mastery and the intention of your work. So take that for what you will. Along those same lines, you want to be really careful about having too many POVs overall in your novel. Again, this really depends on a lot of things, so I won't give a specific number or range that's really good to stay within, but definitely try not to overdo it. If you, the author, are getting confused by your number of people that we're following as readers, then you can bet you've got too many. In my current work in progress, I have 4. 2 make up the majority of the story, and 2 others have very kind of minor roles, but I put them in because I thought that the things that they're involved with and giving their perspective adds a lot to understanding the overall plot to my story. Now, if I had readers follow 6 or 7 characters, that'd be too much. The reader would get lost amidst each plot line and would start getting upset with me for changing to a different character every other chapter. I mean, it'd be a lot. Now, final expectation I want to talk about is voice. Is the internal dialogue in prose reflecting your POV of choice? So in Third Omniscient, you really don't have to worry about this because the narrator's describing things as they are without one particular character's influence. However, if you're writing in First or Third Limited, you'll need to make sure that whosever voice it is, whichever character you're following, that you're reflecting their assessment of their surroundings and situations according to them, not you as the author. So their voice needs to be apparent by their influence, by the character whose POV we're following. So if you're POV is a female, like a female brute warrior, interested in bringing pride to her clan through pillaging. She's not necessarily going to be interested in a pretty pink flower on the road toward the next village. So you wouldn't suddenly write, "She stopped and bent over, admiring the delicate pink petals of the woodland wildflower." This should also come through in your dialogue that your character speaks. That was redundant because dialogue is spoken words. Anyways, the same warrior probably wouldn't say something like, "Galen, would you please get me an ale?" It'd probably be more like, "Galen, bring me an ale." Again, this really follows a path of logic. Your readers will likely let you know that something seems off about a particular scene if your POV isn't quite matching up with what the character is observing, doing, or saying as it applies to their personality, if that makes sense. So, did I miss something? Do you agree or disagree with any of these points? If you'd like to join in the discussion, please feel free to comment below. And I left this out the last few videos, but I will be returning to authorcraft. Today we have Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, and I will be reading a short passage and commenting on it. As soon as the whole company was assembled, standing in a wide circle round Treebeard, a curious and unintelligible conversation began. The Ents began to murmur slowly. First one joined, and then another, until they were all chanting together in a long rising and falling rhythm, now louder on one side of the ring, now dying away there, and rising to a great boom on the other side. Though he could not catch or understand any of the words, he supposed the language was Entish. Pippin found the sound very pleasant to listen to at first, but gradually his attention wavered. After a long time, and the chant showed no signs of slackening, he found himself wondering, since Entish was such an unhasty language, whether they had yet gotten further than good morning, and if Treebeard was to call the roll, how many days it would take to sing all their names. I wonder what the Entish is for yes or no, he thought. He yawned. Now, I really like this passage because Tolkien does an excellent job of making the reader aware of how drawn out and boring it is to listen to an Entish conversation. That was all one paragraph. And while he kind of hints that maybe it wasn't particularly hard on the ears to listen to, it's just very, very boring to listen to. And I think in earlier text, it says something about, I'm sure, about how long it takes something to say in Entish versus a common language or whatever it is they're supposed to be speaking, as everyone else. But this whole paragraph just outlines and kind of lays out how painstaking the language is, especially if you're listening to it. And I love that it ends with "he yawned." It's just like this perfect capstone to what Tolkien is trying to get across. So that is it for me, and I've been slacking lately, and I will try to get better and hopefully do more regular videos on the aspects of the writing craft. So thanks for joining me here on The Right Stuff. Thank you for watching this video, and until next time, keep writing.